Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today's story is not about kings or conquerors. It is not about those who ruled nations or commanded armies. It is about a quiet man from the farmlands of Iowa, a man whose weapon was not a sword but a seed. This is the story of Norman Borlaug, the man who waged war against hunger and won. Born to humble farmers in the American heartland, he grew up watching crops fail and families starve. Yet from that hardship, he forged an unshakable belief that no one should die because the soil gave too little. His journey would take him from the dusty fields of Iowa to the famine-stricken plains of Mexico, India, and Pakistan. And in doing so, he would save more lives than any other person in history. Norman Ernest Borlaug was born on March 25, 1914, in the quiet farmlands of Iowa, where endless fields stretched into the horizon and life revolved around the soil. He was the grandson of Norwegian immigrants, raised in a modest farmhouse with no hint that he would one day alter the course of human history. His childhood was simple, almost ordinary. Days filled with chores, the creak of the barn door at dawn, the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Yet, hidden in this quiet life was a seed of understanding. Norman learned early that food was not just a blessing, but a fragile promise. If crops failed, families suffered. If the rain refused to fall, the land would starve, and with it, the people. It was a lesson written not in books, but in the soil under his fingernails. He was not born a genius, nor did the world prepare a privileged path for him. In fact, Norman's early education was unremarkable. He struggled at times, faltered in exams, and almost failed to secure a place at university. During the Great Depression, when the American economy collapsed, poverty swept through the country like a storm. People lined up for bread in cities, and rural families worried about every grain they could save. Norman's family had little money, and like countless others, they survived by working with whatever the land could give. It was in these years of hardship that Norman developed his unyielding resilience. He refused to accept failure as an ending. He treated it instead as a challenge. When he finally entered the University of Minnesota, it was not as a Golden Boy scholar, but as a struggling student who worked odd jobs just to survive. He washed dishes, delivered goods, and spent nights exhausted, but he never gave up. At first, he pursued forestry, believing he might spend his life among the great northern forests. Yet his path shifted dramatically when he encountered plant pathology, the science of diseases that destroy crops. This field was not glamorous, nor did it promise wealth, but Norman saw in it something that few others did, the chance to fight hunger at its root. He realized that wars, poverty, and suffering were often linked to the failure of the soil. When crops died, nations trembled. When harvests failed, children went hungry. And so, with quiet determination, Norman Borlaug set his sights on something greater than himself, the dream of a world without famine. In 1944, Norman's journey took him far beyond the fields of Iowa. The Rockefeller Foundation launched an ambitious agricultural program in Mexico, a country struggling with failing wheat harvests and a relentless disease known as stem rust. The fungus turned fields black, wiping out entire harvests in a single season. Farmers lived in despair, trapped in cycles of hunger. Scientists before Borlaug had tried and failed, declaring the problem unsolvable. Yet Norman was not the kind of man who backed away from impossible odds. He accepted the challenge and left the comfort of his homeland for Mexico, stepping into an unknown world. What he found there was heartbreaking. Farmers worked tirelessly only to watch their fields perish. Wheat stalks grew tall but fragile, collapsing under the weight of disease. Entire families sank deeper into poverty year after year, and hunger was not an abstract concept. It was a daily reality. Borlaug did not retreat to laboratories or ivory towers. Instead, he bent his back alongside the farmers, sweating under the sun, dirt on his hands, eyes sharp with determination. His method was radical in its simplicity. He would crossbreed thousands upon thousands of varieties of wheat, searching for the one that could resist disease, thrive in poor soil, and feed the hungry. It was work of staggering intensity. In a single year, Borlaug and his team might attempt over 10,000 crosses of wheat varieties, carefully planting, watching, recording, and testing. Each failure was a heartbreak, but he pressed on. Weeks blurred into months, months into years. Critics mocked him, colleagues doubted him, and sometimes even his own spirit faltered under the crushing weight of setbacks. But what defined Norman was not brilliance. It was relentlessness. He refused to quit. At last, after years of struggle, his persistence bore fruit. He developed dwarf wheat, a variety short in stature but mighty in strength. Unlike the tall, fragile stalks that fell under disease or collapsed when grain grew heavy, these new strains stood firm. They resisted stem rust. They responded well to fertilizers. They produced astonishing yields. What had once seemed impossible now became a revolution. Fields that had starved became seas of golden grain. Families who once waited for hunger now waited for harvest. But Norman's mission did not end in Mexico. By the early 1960s, a storm of crisis loomed over Asia. Experts predicted that India and Pakistan, with exploding populations and failing harvests, would descend into famine. The grim forecast suggested that hundreds of millions would perish. Ships loaded with emergency grain docked at ports. Yet even these lifelines could not keep pace with demand. Hunger threatened to overwhelm entire nations. The situation was described as catastrophic, inevitable, and unsolvable. Yet Borlaug believed otherwise. In 1963, he brought his new wheat varieties to India, where he faced skepticism, resistance, and a mountain of bureaucratic obstacles. Officials doubted him. Farmers resisted change. Some accused him of meddling in affairs beyond his country. But hunger does not wait for politics, and Norman did not let obstacles stop him. He and his team planted the new wheat across experimental fields. The results were breathtaking. Stalks stood tall, heavy with grain, immune to the diseases that had destroyed generations of crops. Yield after yield, the evidence grew undeniable. By the late 1960s, India and Pakistan had transformed from nations on the brink of mass famine into nations capable of feeding themselves. What had been predicted as a disaster became a triumph. Millions upon millions of lives, perhaps over 1 billion by historical count, were saved because one man refused to give up. It was called the Green Revolution, and its architect was Norman Borlaug. In 1970, the world finally recognized what he had done. Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for fighting wars, but for waging war against hunger. In Oslo, as he stood on stage to receive the medal, the boy from Iowa who once worked in dusty fields, the young man who once washed dishes to pay for his education, was now celebrated as a man who had changed human destiny. The Nobel Committee declared, more than any other single person of this age, he has helped provide bread for a hungry world. But even in that moment of global recognition, Borlaug did not bask in glory. He remained humble, his eyes fixed not on applause, but on the work still undone. He reminded the world that the Green Revolution was not the end, but only the beginning. Hunger still lurked in many corners, and complacency was the greatest enemy. His words were simple but profound. The Green Revolution has won a temporary success in man's war against hunger. But I cannot rest. We must continue the battle. What made Borlaug extraordinary was not just his science, but his spirit. He never sought fame or wealth. He never turned his back on farmers or spoke only to elites. He lived in fields, worked in dust, and stood shoulder to shoulder with those he sought to help. His vision was vast, but his approach was grounded. One seed, one stalk, one harvest at a time. His humility, coupled with his persistence, became his legacy. Norman Borlaug has been called the man who fed the world. It is estimated that his work saved over 1 billion lives. Think of that number for a moment. 1 billion people who might have perished now lived, loved, worked, and dreamed because one man refused to accept that hunger was inevitable. His story teaches us something far greater than agriculture. It teaches us that greatness is not born of privilege or brilliance, but of relentless determination, compassion for others, and the courage to fight battles most people believe cannot be won. When we look at Norman Borlaug's life, we see a truth that resonates far beyond science. One person can change the fate of humanity. He began as a farm boy with little money, no prestige, and no fame. He stumbled, he failed, and he worked endlessly. Yet he believed that hunger was not destiny, and through that belief, he altered the course of nations. His life whispers to all of us that we need not be extraordinary to achieve extraordinary things. We need only to be relentless, compassionate, and unwilling to surrender to despair. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of all. While wars destroy and politics divide, sometimes the most powerful weapon against suffering is not an army or a leader, but a single seed, nurtured with persistence, grown with courage, and planted with hope. Norman Borlaug's legacy